Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really going deep, tackling a huge theological question. It's all about divine economics, really.
Absolutely.
Right.
We're asking, when the second God paid that ultimate price, with blood, what exactly was on the receipt?
Right. What was bought? Was it just human souls, the ones who make up the church?
Or was it bigger? Did that purchase cover, well, everything? The entire universe, space, time, the whole shebang?
That's the mission for today's Deep Dive. We've got sources presenting two pretty starkly opposing views on this. It connects redemption or atonement with ownership, the purchase price, and ultimately what's inherited.
And nailing this down is fundamental. Was the payment just about fixing the sin problem for beings with free will?
Or was it a much larger transaction,
Yeah.
like buying back the entire cosmos because sin had sort of contaminated everything?
Exactly. A universal ownership claim established through payment.
Okay, so let's map out these two views clearly before we dive in.
Good idea. So, view one, let's call it the limited scope view. This one says, basically, only the church, only souls with free will were actually purchased by the blood.
And this hinges entirely on how you define sin.
Precisely. Then you have view two, the universal scope. This argues, no, the blood price bought everything, the whole space-time continuum, total ownership.
Got it. Two very different pictures. Let's unpack view one first.
Yeah.
All right, view one, its foundation seems to be all about free will. The sources pushing this argue that, fundamentally, only beings with free will can actually commit sin.
That's the absolute cornerstone, yeah. The source material here draws a really sharp line. Sin isn't just, a mistake. It's an act that comes directly from choosing, from free will.
So the consequence is that the blood, the substitutionary payment, is only needed for the one who actually did the wrongdoing, the one who chose it.
Exactly. If there's no free will involved, then the concept of sin, at least in this framework, just doesn't apply to that thing or being.
So what about, like, stars? Or planets? Or, the fabric of space itself? They don't choose. They can't commit a moral offense.
Right, so applying substitutionary atonement to them would be, well, illogical or maybe redundant, according to view one. Crime, transgression, that's purely in the domain of free-willed creatures.
Okay, so space-time itself, lacking that free will, can't sin against God. Therefore,
it doesn't need bloodshed for its redemption. It doesn't carry that kind of guilt.
but hold on, the universe is clearly affected by sin. We see decay, suffering, what Paul called groaning. If it doesn't need blood, how does view one explain its eventual restoration? It's clearly damaged.
Ah, good point. This is where view one makes a distinction. It separates redemption from renewal. Space-time, it argues, is contaminated, yes, but only indirectly. It's affected through the actions of free-willed beings. It's collateral damage, not the perpetrator.
So it's like a crime scene, not the criminal.
Kind of, yeah. So the argument is things without free will, like the physical cosmos, can be renewed, made new by God's power, his word, without needing a specific blood payment to clear guilt. It's the contaminated free will, the soul that rebelled, that needs the substitutionary blood.
Okay, I see the separation. Spiritual problem needs blood. Physical problem needs, essentially, divine repair work.
That's the gist of it.
But this leads to another tricky bit, doesn't it? The difference between purchase and inheritance. View one seems to say the second God inherits the whole universe, but only purchased the church. How does that work legally?
Right. View one splits the mechanisms of acquiring sovereignty. The second God confirms his right to all of space-time, his inheritance, mainly through the resurrection. By conquering death, he demonstrates his ultimate authority and claims victory over all existence.
So the resurrection proves he won the title.
You could say that. It establishes his right to rule and renew everything. But the price paid by blood, the actual purchase transaction, that's specifically targeted. It's reserved only for the souls, the church. They were the ones who racked up the sin debt and needed that specific payment.
Okay, so let me try an analogy. The resurrection is like getting the deed to the entire property through conquest or rightful claim.
Yeah.
But the blood payment is like specifically paying off the mortgage debt incurred only by the tenants living in one part of that property.
That's a pretty good way to put it, yes. Inheritance via victory, purchase via specific debt payment.
So in this view, what happens to all the suffering? The memory of evil, pain, destruction throughout history. If the cosmos is just renewed and the church redeemed, where does all that negativity go?
That's a complex point in view one. The idea proposed is that suffering fundamentally exists in the memory, the consciousness of immortal beings, angels, redeemed humans.
So if you wipe the memory,
Essentially, yes. If the pain, the trauma, the guilt are completely washed away from the consciousness of those who live eternally, then the suffering effectively ceases to exist within the renewed space-time. The problem is resolved on the level of eternal conscious experience.
That assumes consciousness is the only place suffering truly resides eternally.
That seems to be the underlying assumption, yes. If the eternal witnesses no longer remember the hurt has no ongoing reality. Okay, let's pivot now. View 2. This is the one the source material seems to lean into more strongly, and it presents a radically different picture of both the problem and the solution.
Right, this is the universal scope argument. Its core idea is that sin didn't just affect the sinners, it somehow contaminated everything.
Exactly. The entire space-time continuum got polluted, is the argument. And because the contamination is universal, the solution, the purchase by blood, had to be universal too.
Okay, I need to push back here like I did before. If we stick with the idea that space-time lacks free will, how can it be contaminated in a way that requires a blood purchase? It can't be morally guilty.
Right, and View 2 clarifies this. The contamination isn't moral guilt in the same way a person is guilty. It's more like a spiritual and legal defilement. The sources talk about the traces of sin.
Traces of sin. Like a residue.
Sort of. Think of it like, imagine a horrific crime happens in a room. The room isn't guilty, but it's tainted. It carries the memory, the spiritual weight, the vibe, if you will, of what happened. The source argues sin leaves this kind of cosmic footprint, attaching to the very fabric of reality.
And this footprint causes real harm.
Yes, it contributes to suffering, not just for the direct victims or offenders, but even for those witnessing it, and it affects the environment itself. It's a pervasive, lingering toxicity.
So to truly cleanse reality, you can't just fix the sinners, you have to deal with this cosmic residue.
That's the logic. To completely remove sin's influence and its legal implications from all of existence, from the highest heavens to the deepest parts of the earth, or Hades, the entirety had to be legally bought back, redeemed by blood.
Why blood, though? Why not just divine power, like View 1 suggested for renewal?
Because, according to View 2, the contamination creates a sort of legal claim or foothold for the opposing forces, for the origin of sin. To fully extinguish that claim and establish God's undisputed ownership, a payment recognized within that legal or spiritual framework was needed. And blood, representing life and ultimate sacrifice, is presented as that price.
Okay, that's a huge claim. The sources must point to specific scriptures to back this universal cleansing idea. You mentioned Colossians.
Yes, Colossians 1:20 is absolutely central here. It says, God was pleased through Christ to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross.
All things, that's the key phrase, not just all people.
Precisely. View 2 interprets all things, literally the entire created order, the infrastructure of the universe. This isn't just about saving souls, it's about reconciling the cosmos itself. The blood achieves this universal peace, this great atonement for everything.
Okay, this leads us to what you call the crucial synthesis of View 2. This idea that purchase by blood does two things at once.
Exactly. This is where View 2 attempts to offer a more unified legal framework than View 1. It argues the phrase, purchased by blood, has a dual meaning happening simultaneously.
Meaning one.
Meaning one is atonement or redemption. This is the aspect that applies specifically to souls and bodies, freeing them from sin's penalty. This is what we typically think of saving the church, like in Corinthians where it says you were bought at a price.
Right, the substitutionary part, paying the debt for the guilty. That aligns with View 1 partially.
It does. But View 2 adds the second, much broader meaning, acquisition of ownership.
Okay.
The same blood payment that redeems the church also functions as the purchase price that establishes the second, God's total, legal, undeniable ownership over the entire space-time continuum. He bought the whole lot.
Including the parts that View 1 said only needed renewal. The physical universe, everything.
Everything. Lock, stock, and barrel. By paying the price, he secured the deed to every atom, every star, every dimension.
I'm still wrestling with why the blood purchase is needed for universal ownership. View 1 said the resurrection secured the inheritance, the victory. Why isn't that enough? Why the blood for the whole cosmos?
The sources supporting View 2 give a very stark, legally grounded answer. It's about the absolute right to judge and dispose.
Dispose.
Yes. The second God can ultimately judge the wicked, consign them to the lake of fire, and effectively eliminate them from his renewed creation precisely because he owns them. They are his property bought and paid for.
Wow. That's intense.
It is. The argument is if he hadn't purchased the entire space-time, including the wicked individuals within it, his legal right to exercise that kind of final, absolute judgment and disposal might be questionable or incomplete. The purchase price removes all doubt. It secures his right not just to save his own, but to deal definitively with everything and everyone else within his purchase domain.
So even the wicked are his property through the purchase.
Yes, rebellious property, but his property nonetheless, subject to the owner's final decision.
So the purchase isn't just a rescue mission for the good guys. It's the establishment of ultimate sovereign rights over absolutely everything, good and bad, setting the stage for the final judgment as an act of, well, property management.
That's a blunt way to put it, but yes. It frames the final judgment as an exercise of absolute ownership rights acquired through the blood payment. Sovereignty isn't just claimed by victory, it's legally cemented by purchase. #3. The mechanics of atonement, ownership, and judgment.
Okay, let's drill down into the mechanics here, because view 2 rests on a very specific, very high-stakes definition of sin itself. The sources define sin's ultimate reality, its core essence, as choosing to, well, to kill God, to shed his blood.
Yes, this definition elevates sin far beyond simple rule-breaking. It frames it as cosmic treason, an attack on the very source of life and existence. The argument is that the gift of free will inherently contained this dreadful possibility. Creatures could choose to love God and neighbor, sustaining life, or they could choose to reject God, effectively attempting deicide.
And since the sources categorize all humans as having sinned,
They are deemed collectively implicated in this ultimate act of rebellion, this desire to shed God's blood.
okay, if the fundamental sin is that cosmic, that act of trying to kill God, then it makes sense why the solution, the redemption, would need to be equally cosmic in scope, justifying the universal purchase.
Exactly. The scale of the offense necessitates the scale of the remedy. And this ties directly into how View 2 understands the final judgment, often called the Great Day of Atonement.
Right, atonement. You mentioned the Hebrew root earlier, kafar, meaning to cover.
Yes, to cover. Understanding this is absolutely key. It helps explain how one single divine action, this final universal covering with blood, can result in two completely opposite outcomes. Salvation for some, destruction for others.
How does covering lead to destruction? That seems counterintuitive. We usually think of covering as protection.
It is protection for those aligned with what's doing the covering. But think about what the covering is. It's the blood of the second God. It embodies his perfect righteousness, his justice, his life, but also contains the implicit judgment against sin. So, when God, on this great day of atonement, covers the entire space-time with this blood, anything that is fundamentally incompatible with it, anything still clinging to sin, unrepentant, it can't endure that covering. It's like being exposed to pure holiness or pure justice when you're defined by rebellion.
So the covering itself becomes the instrument of judgment for those who haven't been reconciled before the covering happens.
Precisely. They are covered by an element that embodies divine righteousness and wrath against sin, and because they are fundamentally opposed to that righteousness, they are consumed or judged by it.
It's the same covering, but the nature of the thing being covered determines the outcome. Is there an analogy the sources use for this?
Yes, the Noah's Ark analogy comes up frequently. Remember, before the floodwaters came to cover the earth God's judgment, Noah was told to cover the ark, inside and out, with pitch. The Hebrew word for pitch there is kafar, the same root as atonement.
Interesting connection.
So, those inside the ark, covered by the pitch kafar, survived the judgment waters that covered the earth. Those outside, not under that protective covering, perished when the judgment came.
So the blood, like the floodwaters, covers everything.
Yes, but like the pitch, it saves those who are under its specific applied protection beforehand. For those who rejected that protection, the universal covering acts as judgment.
That clarifies the differential impact really well. So for the church, for those who submitted to God, turned from sin, used their free will rightly, the blood covering confirms eternal life. That's atonement as redemption.
Correct. It's protection, substitution, forgiveness, sealed by the covering.
But for those who actively rejected God, who clung to sin, that same universal blood covering manifests as judgment, wrath, destruction, atonement as judgment.
Exactly. The very thing that saves the righteous consumes the wicked. One act, two outcomes, based entirely on the state of the object being covered.
Now, the sources for View 2 also lay out a timeline for this universal atonement. And it's not just earth-focused, it starts in heaven.
Yes, the scope is truly cosmic, involving all dimensions. It unfolds in phases. Phase 1, according to the source, involves the angelic heaven. God's blood covers the angelic realms first.
What does that achieve?
It finalizes the state of the righteous angels. It seems to remove even the possibility of future sin for them. Their free will, having been tested and proven loyal through the cosmic conflict, is sort of locked into righteousness, confirmed eternally.
So securing the loyalty and purity of the heavenly hierarchy is step one.
It seems so. It establishes the uncontested righteous authority before the final judgment descends fully on the lower, more contaminated realms.
And then comes phase two.
Right. The source suggests that while this angelic confirmation is happening, judgment is being poured out below. This is phase 2, Hades and the earth. This involves the 7 plagues or disasters mentioned in apocalyptic literature. Ultimately, the blood covers these realms too, leading to the final judgment of all offenders, all the criminals, as the source puts it.
It's a simultaneous confirmation of the righteous and judgment of the wicked across different dimensions.
That's the picture painted. The single event of universal covering solidifies eternal states.
This brings up a critical point, though. The church, the saints, they were sinners too, guilty of that killing God offense, according to the source's definition. Why do they survive this final fiery covering?
That's where timing and the nature of the purchase become crucial. The argument is, we survive because God acted preemptively for us. Meaning, our specific sins were already forgiven, already covered by his blood through faith and repentance before this final universal covering event. We were purchased first, specifically redeemed to become his servants, his property in a positive sense.
So we were claimed and covered individually before the universal judgment covering.
Exactly. The source emphasizes that we too deserved wrath. But because the second God shed his blood first to cover our personal guilt and legally claim us as his redeemed possession, we are shielded when that same blood functions as universal judgment. We transition from being part of the generally owned rebellious property to being specifically redeemed property. ###HIV. Final synthesis and implications. So, let's just quickly recap the core distinction in View 2, which seems to be the source's main thrust. It's these 2 functions of the blood price: redemption and ownership.
Right. We've established the blood redeemed. That's the substitutionary part, specifically for those with free will, the church, who turn from sin. That saves them from the final fiery judgment.
Check. And second, crucially, the blood purchased the entire space-time continuum. This grants the second God total, undisputed ownership, and the absolute legal authority to enact both judgment and renewal across the board.
So redemption is like a specific application within the larger framework of universal purchase. The purchase gives the right to manage the whole estate, and redemption identifies who gets saved versus who gets disposed of.
Perfectly put. And this loops right back to the significance of free will. The whole cosmic story, in this view, boils down to how creatures use that capacity. Did they use it to effectively participate in killing God, rejecting the owner?
Or did they use it to accept his love, his covering, his ownership, and thereby escape the final consequences of the universal judgment inherent in that covering?
That's the ultimate pivot point for eternal destiny, according to this perspective.
And looking back at View 1, the limited scope argument, View 2 insists that without this universal purchase, God's authority to judge everything contaminated by sin, especially the wicked, would be, well, legally incomplete.
That seems to be the final decisive argument from the sources supporting View 2. If the second God only bought the church, on what absolute legal basis could he judge and destroy unrepentant nations, fallen angels, or even cleanse the physical cosmos itself from the traces of sin? The enemy could still claim some residual right or influence.
But the universal purchase extinguishes all rival claim.
Completely. By buying everything, the source material confirms his absolute, unchallengeable sovereignty over it all. It establishes the necessary authority to purge sin entirely and renew creation under his sole lordship. Judgment becomes an owner dealing with his property, friend and foe alike, based purely on their response to him and his purchase price.
So the price wasn't just paid to save the good guys, but to buy the undisputed right to judge everyone and everything.
That's the profound implication. The payment is the ultimate title deed to all of existence. It makes everything definitively, infinitively, see to command, to save, or to destroy, all according to his perfectly just will, established through that purchase. #outro.
Wow. Okay, that was definitely a deep dive. We've journeyed from seeing the atonement as perhaps just a personal transaction for believers to understanding this much broader perspective. A universal purchase establishing total divine ownership over all space-time.
It really shifts the perspective, doesn't it? understanding the blood price not just as redemption for the few, but as the acquisition of ownership over the many, over everything, it makes the final judgment less about abstract justice and more about, well, the owner settling accounts on his property.
The scale of the sacrifice determines the scale of the resulting sovereignty. It's huge.
So the question then becomes, for you listenings, what does this actually mean?
Well, think about it. If the source defines the ultimate sin as this attempt to kill God, and the blood price is the payment that buys back the entire contaminated cosmos, how does grasping the universality of that purchase, the sheer ownership it establishes, change how you view your own life, your own accountability?
It's not just about personal salvation anymore. It suggests it's also about your status within a universally owned reality. If every square inch of existence belongs to the second God by right of purchase, then your choices, your use of free will, determine your standing not just before a judge, but before the absolute proprietor of all things. It adds a whole layer to personal responsibility within the grand scheme.
A very powerful thought to mull over. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.